And before we get going, here's a word about our sponsors. SDHQ Motorsports is a powerhouse 30,000 square foot facility with 45 family members reporting for duty. This single owner, single location business is based out of Gilbert, Arizona. It can handle anything from a hot rod, daily driver, pre-runner, race vehicle, half-track or Kugelwagen, or just about any other project you need help with. Their skilled staff with hundreds of years of combined experience eats, sleeps, and breathes performance. So go check them out at sdhqmotorsports.com or check them out on Insta at sdhqmotorsports. The We Happy Few 506 podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Gettysburg Museum of History, home of the Major Dick Winters collection and the largest assortment of authentic Band of Brothers artifacts in the world. Visit the free museum at 219 Baltimore Street in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, or at www.gettysburgmuseumofhistory.com, and on the YouTube channel, The History Underground, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Well, hello, and welcome along to another We Happy Few 506 podcast. A little late, I think he's in hair and makeup, but we do have two incredible guests. Introduce the man to my right first, because he's going to help me out. We have from the 100th Bomb Group Foundation. How you doing, Maddie?
Good. How are you guys?
I think we've just got Doug joining us. Hey, Dougie, how you doing, man?
Hey.
We're recording.
How are you guys?
I think I hear you reasonably well.
You hear us reasonably well?
Yeah, I think so.
Good. Well, I'm gonna get Matt to do an introduction for you, John. I didn't do it justice.
Standing by.
Standing by. Take it away, Matt.
Thanks, guys. So this is a man who almost needs no introduction, but we have with us here a distinguished veteran of the 100th Bomb Group, Dr. John Alden Clark, who flew combat missions starting back in 1944. But in addition to his wartime service, Dr. Clark has done so much over the years, to represent his fellow veterans and, attend events and help keep that history alive. But I want to introduce a man who I consider a fine friend and a fine member of the 100th, Dr. John Clark.
I missed the doctor out. I'm so glad you did the introduction. John, how you doing?
I'm all ears. Just whatever you want to start with questions, we'll go right ahead.
Okay, I have a question. Where did you grow up? For the war as a Depression baby.
Well, I was born in the University Hospital in Ann Arbor, Michigan. But my family lived in a small town north of the city of Detroit called Royal Oak. And so I was born in a hospital, but then spent all of my youth years until about World War II in the city of Royal Oak. My father had bought two lots in the sort of rural area. It was not a populous place at all, and he built his own home. I lived in it until I was 17 years old, and he hadn't quite finished it yet. So we went through a number of different living experiences, especially in the wintertime. 4 rooms, there were 5 children. I had 2 brothers and 2 sisters. I'm the middle one of the 5, and lived in that house and went to school from there until I got out into the world. Both my parents, who might be interested in this, were World War I veterans. My mother, who was really quite handicapped, she had only one useful arm, but she did enlist in the Navy as a stenographer or office worker and lived in the city of Washington, D.C. My father, who had roamed the world quite a bit at that time, was a wireless operator. He could take Morse code at a very, very high speed, something like over 100 words a minute without error. And he was with the Naval Communications Center at Anacostia in Washington, D.C. And they met, as young people usually do, at a local dance, and were married in 1919 and lived together for the next 75 years.
Wow.
So can I jump ahead? What did you do when you left?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that.
Oh, sorry. I said, what did you do when you left school?
Which school?
So when you this is probably a good transition point. When you left high school and went on to collegiate studies, I think that was around the time you developed an interest in aviation. Is that right?
Oh no, my interest in aviation went back almost to the Versailles Treaty. Uh, I got a small kit, but let me back this up a little bit more fundamental. You see, I was born in the early 20s, and this was about the time that the American aircraft industry, the American interest, commercial and military, were beginning to blossom. So, in fact, Commanding General Doolittle of the 8th Air Force was a West Point graduate working at MIT in Cambridge on blind flying in 1920. So that was the beginning of the air age, and we're beginning to just become interested in that. And for the general public was gradually accepting aviation as a kind of a normal way of life, including the military. So in the late 20s, Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic. Of course, everyone remembers that. That puts aviation of the air as another dimension in our transportation system and other uses of aircraft. So we're just beginning, as the general public, interested in airplanes. To support this, my home was about 20 miles from U.S. Army Air Base at Mount Clemens, Michigan, Selfridge Field. And we had all manner of fighter planes flying in that area when I was 2 and 3 years old and all during my youth. So I watched those. And then about 1930, I somehow came upon a kit for a model plane. And I made it, glued things together, probably pretty crude, but I got a beginning interest in aviation supported by what I see in the sky around our house. So my whole life and interest and plans for the future at that time was to become an aircraft and become a pilot. During the day, it was supported by, well, back up a little bit, even Henry Ford, whom I guess you all know who he was. He had an aircraft division as part of the Ford Motor Company. His son Edsel sort of ran it, but they built the Ford Tri-Motor Transport. You probably have seen them around. Some are still flying, and even now, the Yankee Air Museum near my home and where I was raised has a flyable Ford Tri-Motor, all metal, corrugated structure for added strength, and that's still flying. And it's 3 engines, and it takes people for rides and help to introduce them to the beginning of aviation in the area in which I was raised. And then, of course, all over the world with the Ford Tri-Motor.
Wow. So can you talk us through where you were when you heard about the attack on Pearl Harbor? And
Yes, exactly. My older brother had been drafted into the U.S. military in November of 41. I was the first year at a technical college beginning in September of 41, living at home. But my brother was sent to a place near where we lived in Battle Creek, Michigan. It's called Fort Custer. And he was there, and we went over to visit him for a Thanksgiving day. It's about a 3 to 4 hour drive in those days from our home in Royal Oak to Battle Creek, Michigan, where Fort Custer was located. And we happened to leave in the morning of December 7th. And when we arrived at the gates to the camp, the camp gates were closed, and 2 armed guards were standing in front of the gate and told us to turn around. The camp is closed until further notice, and return to our homes. So we were, of course, somewhat unnerved by that. And the question of Japanese relationships was no secret. It's in the news, but we couldn't connect anything positive. So we turned around in a Model A Ford. I remember that. And in those days, about a 4-hour drive back to our home north of Detroit in Royal Oak, a famous British name, by the way. I think you'll recognize that.
Yes.
All that. But as soon as we got home, we turned on our radio. That's all we had in those days, with no television, of course. And as soon as that radio came on, the first thing we heard was that ominous static sound. And then noise in the background. And then a voice broke in and said, we are trying to make contact with Washington to get more information for you of the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor this morning. That's how we learned about it. On the evening of December 7, 1941.
Wow. And did you enlist straight away?
Try that again, please. What
did you enlist straight away?
Oh, no, I didn't. I was in 41. I was about 16 or 17 years old, probably close to 17. And I was the draft did occur in the United States in 1940. So the issue of military service was on people's minds. However, I was a little young for the Air Force, but I finished that year in a technical college called the Lawrence Institute of Technology, and got a job in Detroit while I was going to school, working on the design of production machinery for the war effort. That brings us up to the morning of December 8th. That was a Christmas season, as all over the world, I suppose. I was working as a clerk in a grocery store, and I continued that while we kept I stayed in school, and but with a little less enthusiasm for academic work, I'll admit that at that time. Talk of joining the services and getting involved in the military, of course, was on everyone's mind. In fact, my brother was already in as a private soldier.
Being a foot, you though, no?
Say again, please.
Being a foot soldier.
Well, he served on the medical corps. He ended up in India for a while. Came back, stayed in the U.S. Is going ahead years ahead now. And then in the last year of the war, he was in Europe with the medical corpsman in Germany.
Wow.
It's not a combat job, and the war was over by the time he got there. But the need for medical services did not stop for the military.
No. So, when did you go? When did you enlist? When did you become part of the Air Force?
Good story. I'll get into that right now. I, of course, was always interested in the Air Corps. I made models, and I wrote school papers and talked to the Army recruiting centers in Texas when I was 15 and 16. So I had no question in my mind that I would join the U.S. Army Air Corps. That was the technical name for it then. At the same time, I had made a friendship with our congressman's son in high school. And at a meeting, I'm not sure how that all worked out, but the congressman spoke to me. He knew I had a high grade record in school. And he said, "John, would you like to consider the West Point Military Academy?" This would have been sometime in the early fall of 1941. probably a little before Pearl Harbor. I said, well, yes, I would like to consider that. He said, well, I make the appointments, the congressman told me, but you have to pass an examination, written examination, and the highest score gets the honor. Well, I went to the place in Detroit where about 300 people were all there to take that exam from the various congressional districts. And
what percentage did you get, John?
I beg pardon?
What percentage did you get on the test?
Can I come into that? I'll let you know what happened.
I don't want to tread on your lines. Go on.
I had actually enlisted in the Air Corps in the August of that year. Excuse me, this is 1942 now. And the Air Force heard about that. They heard about they knew about it, of course. They heard about the West Point exam, probably from my congressman. And the Air Force was going to call me up early in the fall of 42, but they delayed it until the results of the West Point exam came. And one day, I either got a letter or I met the congressman, and he said, John, I'm sorry, I wish I could give you better news, but you came in second, a few percentage points behind the one who was getting the appointment. But just stick with it. You did the best you could, and you came in pretty high, probably about a cough away from getting the West Point appointment. Of course, that was a big disappointment. We were out living in a situation at home where there's never any money. We were sometimes without food in the house. So the West Point exam appointment would have meant a lot, and it would kind of settle me in, I thought. Probably not exactly true, but set into a military career. So I went back and became just an ordinary GI private. The Air Force called me up in February, and I ended up then in a GI boot camp at near St. Louis, Jefferson Barracks, Missouri. Pneumonia Gulch is where I spent the first 6 weeks, learning to salute, learning to say yes, sir, no excuse, sir, marching, and all those useful things that every soldier should know. So I didn't get the West Point appointment. Big disappointment. But as I look back on it now, that was the best thing that ever happened to me, because my career was directed much more positively along the lines I wanted it to. And because 5 years later, I got to have my story again a little bit. I was on the faculty at MIT, and one day a fellow walked in the door and he said, I've been told to talk to you about supervising my master's degree thesis in mechanical engineering. And he gave his name, and it was the very guy that went on to West Point ahead of me 5 years earlier than that. So he came in my office as a graduate student. I had been through flight training, war, and degrees from the University of Michigan, MIT, two of them, and he was just getting into the game. So you see, looking back, not going was the best thing that ever happened to me. Not going to West Point. And I had learned as I got older, mature, more reasoned, that the West Point was not a key to all future happiness and success. It's a good start, of course. But my own start, I had a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and a doctor's degree under my belt by the time he walked into my office when I was on the faculty at MIT. So things always turn out differently than you expect. I was not disappointed then.
There's clearly only one winner there. Good.
Yeah.
So Should we jump ahead and talk about your training on the B7?
Training on what?
The B-17?
Oh, yeah, okay. That's it's a long story, and it's a little bit ahead of where I am in my remark, but I'll lead to it right now. I'll speak about the military experience, as I would call it. I spent 6 weeks in the Pneumonia Gulch at Jefferson Barracks in Missouri in the month of May and part of June of 1943. This is now. And when we finished the learning how to march and so on, we were all shipped, about 300 of us, out of that training camp and were sent to a college in the Midwest. The Air Corps was having such a rush of the people volunteering for it, and they ran out of training airplanes as well, training bases. They were sending applicants to the Air Corps to spend about 6 weeks in a small college scattered throughout the United States. They had all of their requirements apart from pre-war, and so they're also getting applicants that were just barely out of high school and had no college at all. Well, I had about better part of a year before I went into the Air Force, and but that was a situation when I got to the Cedar Falls, Iowa campus of an Iowa Teachers College. It was a very delightful place to be. The campus, there were no students on the campus. We got the dorms. They left the dining room and the kitchen. We had tremendous food, but in a sense, spoiled by being called into the dean's office, who was civilian administrator. 3 of us out of about 300, I would guess. He said, "I've been looking over your records, and there's no reason why you should be here at all." I had a little bit. He said, "Each of you got virtually 100% on your general service to the examination down in Jefferson Barracks. So with the approval of the commanding officer here, I'm going to send you on to Santa Ana, California on the first train to enter into Air Force selection and Air Corps selection, and on the road to cadet training." And that's what happened. 3 of us left the main group we were in and landed about 10 days later, middle of July, 43, in Santa Ana to get into the very first beginning of the education the Army way, Air Force way, for aviation cadets. Exams, exposures, talk about aircraft policies, and then, of course, the eye test, depth projection test, physical test. But I passed all those things, and then I was asked, "What do you want to be? A pilot, navigator, or bombardier?" That was already settled in my mind. I told them I wanted to be a pilot. So they put me on the list of cadets leading to flight training as a pilot. There are 3 phases. You perhaps even know this. Primary training, where you fly nice airplanes, safe airplanes, little airplanes, 200 horsepower biplane Stearman is what I had at a base near Los Angeles in the Mojave Desert at 29 Palms, California. So I went there with a group of, I suppose about 300 cadets, and it's a civilian-operated air base. All the instructors were civilian. The check pilots were military officers in the Air Corps, and went through primary flight training, learning how to start the engine, learning how to inspect the aircraft, learning how to steer it down the runway on takeoff, and just manage the control, and then into a series of practicing maneuvers like along the road, straight road, S along the road, loops, spins. We learned how to spin, get out of a spin. Probably one of the most important things I learned there was something that we abbreviate as needle ball airspeed. You ever hear that? Young Kennedy, who crashed some years ago in the ocean, should have known that. He didn't. When a pilot loses his visibility and orientation with a fixed horizon, like on a good day, you can always see the horizon. Even a cloudy day, you get a sense of the horizon. When you lose that, this is like shutting your eyes, basically, or as in the case of Kennedy, flying in that night out over an expanse of water where there's no horizon at all. The aircraft, inevitably, because it's always moving on a little bit, gets into a turn. And you may be aware of a turn or aware of something, but you don't know how to get out of it because you have no reference point. And that turn turns into a steeper and steeper and steeper turn. It's called the death spiral. And the question, needle ball airspeed, is how the instructors taught us young pilots learning this plane as needle and the ball are part of an instrument on a plane. The ball is showing the aircraft is in a bank, and the needle shows it's turning. But without training, that's meaningless to you. And you watch the airspeed, because if the airspeed increases, you're probably going down. If it decreases, you're probably going up. Not probably, you are. So needle ball airspeed is a little saying that every pilot, and we learned this in primary, center the ball, you push the rudder pedal and push the ball out of the corner where it's residing. Center the ball, center the needle. The needle is showing that the aircraft is turning. Center the needle, and then when the needle is centered and the ball is centered, your aircraft is either going straight down or straight up. The airspeed tells you which way you're doing. So you center the ball, center the needle, watch your airspeed. If the airspeed is increasing, you just pull back on the stick and straighten it out until the airspeed no longer increases. If the airspeed is decreasing, it means you're climbing up to a stall. That would be a pretty tough situation. You push the stick forward, and you then get back to stable flight. Well, that was one of the things that we missed, and I actually used that flying a B-17, strange as it might be seen. But it's a very fundamental idea for young pilots. I spent about 70 hours in this twin wing Stearman, and finished the course, and then passed on to the next second phase of pilot training in the United States Air Corps at that time. That was to go to an aircraft considerably more complicated. I look back on it now, it's not really complicated, but it looked like it would. It's an all-metal, single wing, Vultee vibrator, we called it, BT-13. And that was taught to us at another base in Central California at Merced Army Air Base. Here we did, we graduated to a slightly more complex aircraft. First of all, it had a sliding canopy for the student pilot in front and the instructor in the back, or vice versa sometimes. It had radio communication, so when you got into the airplane on the ground, you call the tower for instructions as to where to taxi. It had a radio for getting signals from the ground, part of a navigation system. It had an engine that was 450 horsepower, and the propeller could be positioned in two positions: low pitch at high takeoff, and then forward higher pitch at cruising. And we went through the usual flight things, learning to take off, to land, to recover from spins. It also had a set of flaps, which we didn't have in primary. So you got a little bit more experience with more equipment in the basic training, that was what it was called. And I was there at Merced for about 3.5 months, 2.5, 3.5 months. until we all finished the course. And then we went on to advanced flight school of another 2 months' work, after which we would get commissioned as officers, most of us, and to get the wings of a pilot. That's called advanced flight training. And as soon as we got the assignment, I knew pretty much what was going to happen to me, because we went to a twin engine school to fly twin engine aircraft. Called the Cessna Bobcat. It's not a very challenging aircraft, but it was twin engines. It went into formation practice, long distance, cross country flight practice, and perhaps most important of all, landing through the current system of locating a place in fog and cloud called the name slips my mind at the moment, but to make radio range location of your aircraft with the radio and radio beams. So we learned how to do that, and then once you're located where you were, you could then take up a heading to your desired landing place. That's called instrument landing, instrument navigation. They don't do that anymore, of course. We have much more important ways of doing it and more accurate. But we did go through that whole course so we could fly into a cloud, not see. We fly by instruments to stay in the cloud and locate a position by a radio beam, by sound in your ears. I won't go into those details because it was all gone now. We don't have that anymore. Then graduation in April of 1944. The wings that were pinned on by a close friend. My mother traveled from Michigan to pin on my wings, and I got the commission of second lieutenant and the official Air Force occupational specialty as pilot. Of course, limited to the aircraft that I had checked out in. I had 10 days absence, or leave of absence then. I went back to central Michigan for about 10 days just to say goodbye and put things together. And then I got orders to go to Las Vegas, Nevada. Not for football, and not for gambling, but Las Vegas was a very important flexible gunnery school for aircraft gunners. Flexible in the sense that in a B-17, for example, there are windows in the back of the fuselage. Machine guns are mounted on a pedestal. And Las Vegas was training those gunners, applicants, at the gunnery school at Las Vegas. They also learned how to operate the ball turret gunner in a B-17 and then the other bombers we had, and tail gunners, and they just learned about how to load the gun and clear the gun and become flight gunners on, in my case, 8th Air Force bombers, which was the assignment they knew would be in the future. However, something else happened there, which affected my life rather significantly. The first night I was in Las Vegas, I went into the officers' club, sat down, and was writing a letter home. I happened to look up, and here came this beautiful young woman in a uniform with pilot's wings on, walking down the aisle, and went right past where I was sitting. So, of course, I really had to do something, you know. So I just stopped her, and I said, are you a pilot? And she said, yes. She said, I'm a WASP. Have you ever heard of the women pilots in the United States at all? That's Women's Air Force Service Pilots. You can write a dictionary about them, but 1,000 women were trained just exactly the same training that the men had. They were trained in Texas, and this young woman told me her name was Marie and that she came from Iowa. And I learned that she was a classical musician in regular life, but she wanted to learn to fly and then passed all the flight tests we had as a Air Force pilot. At Las Vegas, she flew P-39s, P-63s, AT-11s, twin engines, checked out as co-pilot on B-17, and got the whole line of things. But the primary task in flying was to make simulated fighter attacks on the B-17s that flew out of Las Vegas for gunnery training. My job was to learn how to fly the B-17 as a co-pilot, just sitting in it and watching it, asking questions and so on. But we had a very good ground school as well. So I nearly met my future wife, by the way, as a woman very much similar in interest to mine. She was a classical musician, which in our high school system in the 1930s, she was a national champion, I learned later on. And at Sweetwater, she bailed out of an airplane one time and became a member of our Caterpillar Club, which is another story, but she had parachute experience as well.
Wow.
Well, we were married for 63 years until she passed away about 15 years ago. Had a wonderful marriage, and she had got back into classical music, teaching and performing, a principal flute in every orchestra that she ever got into, and had a very satisfying life as we traveled around the country from one university to another. Well, that finished my Las Vegas experience, and I got about 50 hours in the right seat. I learned what all the things were for in the cockpit. And as someone told me one time, the first time they saw a cockpit of a B-17, he thought it was a Grand Canyon filled with clocks. And that's about the way I felt. Every engine has 4 or 5 indicators. We have 4 engines. So at the very minimum, you keep your eye on 16 different gauges. And as the time went on, we learned the importance of all of those, especially in combat operations. After Las Vegas, I was shipped to Lincoln, Nebraska. This was a classification center for flight crews. All the various specialties of co-pilot training, gunnery training, pilot training, all landed at Lincoln, Nebraska to gather together to form combat flight crews, following pretty much 8th Air Force prescriptions. And so a couple of days at Lincoln, Nebraska, we formed, the Air Force formed a 10-member group of us, 4 officers, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, and the rest gunners, turret gunners, waist gunners, to be shipped to another base in Tennessee to follow 8th Air Force methods of assembly and squadron flying for combat operations. We spent, I think I got about 150 hours additional of B-17 flying training at this base in Tennessee. At the end of August of 44, this is now, all the crews were then sent back to Lincoln, Nebraska, and we were assigned a new airplane, a new B-17. They called it, "You're buying the airplane." And literally, the pilot had to sign papers saying that he owned the airplane. I don't ask her to explain why, but that's what they called it. We sold the plane back in England when we got there. And so we were then assigned this aircraft. Our crew got familiar with it, and we flew around Lincoln, Nebraska for a couple of days to get sort of familiar with it. I won't enlarge on this here, I'll come later. Every aircraft looks the same, made by the same manufacturer, it's got the same name, but it doesn't fly the same. Especially the engines don't all have equal fuel consumption. We ended up in a Belgian swamp a few months later because of that last factor. But so you try to get equipment. I used to tell when I gave talks to students in schools around, or we're living, storytelling. They want to learn about the war and flying. I told them getting a new airplane is a little bit like getting married again. Surprises at every turn. All airplanes don't fly the same. The only way to really learn to fly is to fly the airplane and get caught up as much as you can with the engine rates of fuel consumption, the trimming sections for the ailerons, rudder, and elevator, and get the feel of the aircraft in flight. That's how you really learn to fly a plane. And for that reason, every time you change an airplane, you fly it for a few hours, 2 or 3, just to learn that landing approach characteristics. They're a little different, and it's not much of a difference. Doesn't take much of a difference to create an enormous problem for the flight crews. Anyway, we got an airplane assigned to us. We also had to sign for that, and given instructions in the first part of September, 44 now, to fly that airplane first to New Hampshire, then to Goose Bay, Labrador, then to Reykjavik, Iceland, and then down to an English air base, which happened to turn out to be in Wales, Valley, Wales. And that's where we left it. More or less routine, of course, from, as you can see, flying across the North Atlantic, swinging south of Greenland is anyway routine, but that's the way we went. Every little jolt and toggle of the aircraft when you're south of Greenland at about 5,000 feet makes it pick up your interest, you know. We did have a one instrument oil pressure gauge that began to flutter, and so we decided, the pilot decided, he and I together, of course, what we should do is, are we going to lose an engine or what? And we decided probably, the flight engineer was a very astute fellow. He said his guess is it's just the instrument, because the instruments are all fairly new. But we radioed back to Goose Bay and told them our situation and told them how we would just decide on this and our approximate location. And then the pilot made the decision to continue on to Iceland, which was the right decision, as it turned out. When we landed at Reykjavik, we spent about a day and a half there. The aircraft was serviced. The instrument man looked over our oil pressure gauge, and he found it was, in fact, not working properly. He replaced the gauge, and everything was fine. Then after about a day and a half at Reykjavik, Iceland, we got orders to take off. By the way, in Goose Bay, they put in an additional gas tank, 400 gallons, in the bomb bay, because the long flight was about 9 or 10 hours, and we needed to have extra fuel. Every aircraft got that. It was taken out in Iceland, and we returned to our regular tank. And then we got orders to fly to Wales. The day they chose to take us to go, an enormous storm hit Reykjavik. We took off heavily loaded with about 50-knot crosswind into a storm and climbed up through that storm, thunderstorms and lightning, and as we swung our course back south towards the British Isles. It took us about an hour to get out of that storm. The aircraft was bouncing around in heavy turbulence. But it's wartime, and you fly when you need to fly, and so we did, and so did everybody else that flew that day. By the time we got out of that storm, we happened to break out, I remember now, about 2,500 feet, right at the Hebrides of Scotland. Looked down, beautiful sight, the Scottish Islands and the ocean smashing up against the cliffs. It was quite a sight from where we were. The clouds had disappeared, and we then just kept a normal flight on into the Irish Sea. We got a radio message that divert your flight to Nuts Corner, Ireland. Never heard of it, never saw it, never did it. By the time we got part way to Nuts Corner, we got another message that return to Valley Whale. They use code names, of course, to point B and land. And that's what we did. Came in over the Irish Sea. And I remember especially when I was assigned a pilot back in the States, I was really lucky. I got a fellow named Chuck Blanding who had 2,000 hours in the B-17 as an air instructor. And they're breaking up those schools and putting them into combat positions. And Chuck turned to me as we're landing in Wales. He said, "John, you want to land it?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd like to." And he said, "Take it easy because we're heavy." I remember those words, and I did not disappoint him. But we landed in Wales, taxied up, hopped out, cleared our baggage, signed some more papers, turning the Air Force B-17 back to the Air Force. And then we were shipped off to a relocation center somewhere in central Michigan, central England. It's routine all the way in this case. And there were a couple of days there. Our crew was put on an order to stand by for departure within the next 10 hours. And sure enough, paper went up, our crew was listed, and we saw our names, crew names listed to report to a railroad station for transport to by English transport. I think it probably said to East Anglia. I'm not sure now, but we went on this English train, baggage, all of us. It happened to be quite late in the afternoon, and by the time we got to the station at Dis, the railroad station, it was dark and it was raining, and we all got out. There was loaded with other crews as well, going to other air bases, and we were told to find the truck that's going to Thorpe Abbotts. Thorpe Abbotts, of course, is the home of the 100th Bomb Group. We all piled into the truck and drove about 6 or 8 miles and taken to a building on the base. I was met by an officer with a clipboard, naturally, and he welcomed us and he said, "Welcome to the 100th Bomb Group. In the 8th Air Force," I'm quoting him, "we are known as the Bloody Hundredth. Welcome." And so that was our welcome about midnight of that night. We were assigned sleeping quarters, kind of got settled down in the irregular way that you always do when you get to a new base. And the next morning, called in for the commanding officer, met with us and the other high-ranking officers, and they said, "Well, we're glad to have you. We lost 11 aircraft just a week before you came, and you are replacement for them." The 100th Bomb Group had lost almost the whole squadron at the target called Lublin, near the Polish border. It was a refining town for petroleum. And that was and they said, the commanding officer also said, "We are known as the Bloody Hundredth," and that is part of the reason. During my stay, the better part of the last year of the war, I finished before the war was over, but during that time, we lost 12 aircraft twice in a squadron, once at Hamburg and once on Christmas Eve, Battle of the Bulge. Come to that probably later on. But so he said, "We know you fly the airplane, but we have to learn now how to fly it as the 8th Air Force does, how we assemble, what formations we have, landing procedures, call signs, and the general geographic location where you are." We were at Thorpe Abbotts, of course, in East Anglia, almost exactly halfway between Norwich and Ipswich by a straight line. That's Thorpe Abbotts. And then he said, "We'll have about two practice missions. The whole crew goes along, and we just learn how to the way we assemble here, the kind of assembly we have, where the positions are of the aircraft in each squadron. And that was Colonel Jeffries. And we never could satisfy him in formation, even on missions. He'd fly along on missions and he constantly hear, close it up, close it up. And he was dead right, of course. The bomb pattern on the ground reflects the pattern in the air. So if your aircraft are scattered several hundred yards apart, and I've seen some groups that way, the bombs, when they drop, fall hundreds of yards from each other, and you don't concentrate the bombs where you're supposed to be. So I get it together. Jeffries was our colonel. He was 3 years older than I was. I was 21, I think, 20 at that time. Youth prevailed in the combat squadrons. We had colonels, lieutenant colonels that were about as old as my older brother, really. So after a couple of these assembly practices, we then were assigned a combat mission to the city of Mainz on the 8th. What was that? It was in October 11, I think, 1944. That was the beginning then of our combat operations. And we went along with them, and it turned out that there's a little bit of flak. I saw the unusual side of the Germans had a little rocket plane that would go straight up. ME-163 was called. It went right through our formation on that mission. Most people never even seen that airplane. Another Nazi experiment when they thought they had the greatest idea in the world that was never used for anything. So that was the beginning, and we went out to learn to fly formations and combat formations. Now, I had one major problem that I had to somehow get resolved. It was probably encouraged by the flight crews. In the States, we rarely got above, we practiced on oxygen once. We rarely got above 15,000 feet in training. Here, the squadrons would fly, I think the lowest I ever remember was about 20,000 feet, but more times was 25,000 to 35,000 feet. The outside thermometer read minus 65 degrees Fahrenheit. And I was wondering how we're going to keep warm. So I started experimenting the first 4 missions with heavy coats and things that sort of got in the way, mainly. And I ended up flying with basically summer flight clothes with a flight jacket, not a summer flight jacket, but a flight suit, which was summer wear, flight boots, and that's just about it, because I had my first mission, had all the electric heat on everything, and I nearly sweated myself out of the cockpit. And that it has an important effect, because when you're sweating and you're at high altitude, the sweat condenses inside your goggles. So the point where often you just had to take them off. Over the target, we wear the goggles just for shrapnel or anything that come in. The glasses might stop them, but we abandoned those with too much heat on. I ended up with just the electric liner and flight boots hooked into our electrical heating system, and that was plenty for me. In the cockpit, you're always moving around, so your upper body is kept warm by exercise. And in combat flying, pilots and co-pilots do just about equal jobs. The pilot's principal responsibility is the crew, and his word is law. But the flying is shared between pilot and co-pilot just about equally, because you get so flying close formation flying, you're constantly moving. And at one time, we were on the bomb run, and I was in the right seat, flies off the left wing of the lead ship. I was trying to keep it in real close, and managed to do that, but I began to sweat. And I was gradually my goggles had sweat working right on down. So finally I was looking out the bottom of them because I couldn't turn the plane over to check because we were already in formation. I finally just took the goggles off and flew the rest of the way without, hoping for the best. So my first 4 missions, I solved the problem of what to wear on a combat mission. The answer is simple: virtually nothing more than you'd have flying around in summer weather, but with the electric heat, that's made the difference. Well, the first mission was to mines, and we got into 8th Air Force technique. You probably have heard about this. I don't know if you have or not, but you should. The 8th Air Force, once they got into Germany, had a special technique of approaching the target. There's a
I think we lost him for a while there. You there, Dougie? You can hear me? You're on mute.
Yeah, I think he's froze, but wow.
I'm thinking we should invite him back for a part 2 because we keep this for 1 hour and then do part 2.
Yeah, I was thinking break it down into sections because it's got so much
I know.
to
So
tell.
I think if we can just cap
incredible.
it there and do part 1, and we can get him
Yeah.
back on and do part 2,
I think
I think we could probably get 4 episodes out of this.
Yeah.
What do you think, Leighton?
Yeah, no, he's
Yeah.
fantastic.
It's
Yeah.
amazing, isn't it? You
Should
just
we-
like
We'll get back to him and say that
trying to sort of visualize what he's doing and going through, but it's
I've got
really detailed. It's almost like we.
I
could
know I've got
split it
so many
down.
questions I haven't asked. We've had so much, so incredible, so much incredible information there. This one podcast does not do any of it justice. So what we're going to do, hopefully, with John's blessing, is we're going to do a series of podcasts on this and just get all the. I've barely asked any of the questions. There's so much fascinating stuff being led by the lead plane and the lead navigator, and what happens when he goes down. I've got so many questions. So hopefully, what we'll do is we'll get John on again, and we'll just let him carry on telling his story. When we can, we'll ask questions and lead him around. And I don't know, who knows, Dougie? It might be 5 podcasts.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he just had so much. This is such a fascinating story. I think it's, we need to break this down into parts and think, because of the whole, the training section and the traveling from New Hampshire all the way to sort of somewhere else in Greenland and Wales. And I think if we kind of, have that section and then, because he's basically got to like his first or second mission.
And he's in 1927, yes.
Yeah, and like we haven't asked a question yet.
I was just listening. I was just thinking, I hope he doesn't stop because I have no idea where I'm on my questions now, and I've just been listening to him. I'm like, yeah, that was really good. Yeah, so we'll sign off for now. Thanks everyone for watching. I wanted to do a generic apology to all our sort of social media followers and stuff. I'm usually quite involved and answer questions back and all the rest of it, but I've had a bonkers couple of weeks. So if you've stacked up a bunch of questions in my DMs, know this, that I have been in and out of government buildings for the last 10 days, and I'm to shoot myself, but everything is all good. I'm not in trouble. It's just bureaucratic nonsense and forms and things. Wow. So don't worry. So thank you very much for your patience. I will start answering messages soon. And yourself, Dougie, all good?
Yep, all good's here. Yeah, I'm just looking forward to listening to hearing more of what you're saying, because we were right in the middle of
right stuck in. We was right stuck in.
Yeah, right stuck in. So yeah.
All right, Boo. I'm gonna get out of here. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you next week.
Yep, catch you next week.
Cheers, guys. Cheers.
Cheers.